if I'm not talking loud enough for someone from the back and you can't move up, signal with your hand by saying, let me know that you can't hear me. Yes. Are you guys going to be able to do without my microphone? Yes, sir. All right, I'll start, and eventually we'll have a microphone, perhaps. At least we have the visual of it. This is a tutorial on the elementary verbal relations described by B.F. Skinner in his book Verbal, which you can get a nice copy of on the bookstore. B.F. Skinner Foundation version, but there's a easily to use. It's a nice high-quality paperback. Everyone should have it in their Bible, although it's not easy to read. Okay, I should talk. All right. The tutorial was initiated by the Verbal Behavior Special Institute, BBC, and by its current president, Bill Collins, which introduced it. My collaborator in the development of the tutorial is Kyra Miguel, who is a graduate student and a doctoral student at Western University. He comes from Catholic University of Brazil, where his advisor was Dr. Maria Amalia Andre. She was at this conference presenting a paper and participating in several poster sessions. In this session, we will describe and provide examples of Skinner's elementary verbal relations. We will not be discussing philosophical and theoretical implications of Skinner's approach, although there are, of course, many. Our purpose in this particular tutorial is simply to generate a repertoire on your part so that you can talk about and can understand what other people talk about when they use these technical terms that relate to Skinner's breakdown of elementary verbal relations. I'm also not going to talk about the implications of this approach for teaching language to those who do not have it, for teaching language, for example, to autistic children. I will mention a few of those implications, but in fact, there's a paper that Sundberg and I just recently submitted or is in press in Behavior Modification, Journal Behavior Modification, and that paper discusses at length the relationships and the possible benefits of using Skinner's approach to language in work with autistic children. Who would like to have that paper, email me, and I'll send you a pre-publication copy. I'm not sure when the actual journal will be printed. Email me a request for the paper by Sundberg and myself, and also you can email me for a copy of the large size overheads that you'll be seeing, but you have a copy of the overheads reproduced in this handout. I would like to dedicate this tutorial to the memory of Esther Davey, head grammar, speech and language pathologist, a significant contributor to the application of Skinner's analysis of verbal. I'm sure Esther gave many tutorials and workshops, very much like this one. I hope mine can be as useful. Skinner began his efforts to develop a behavioral approach to human language in 1934. The final version appeared in 1957 as the book Verbal. His goal was to provide an analysis that could cover approximately the same subject matter. Testing. Still not going. Now it's going. Good. Now I can yell at you. Okay. Is that all right? Is it loud enough? Can the people who adjust it turn it up a little louder? It's right on my tie, close. Let's have it a little louder. Okay. That's better. That's good. Okay. Skinner's goal in writing the book Verbal Behavior was to provide an analysis in his own behavioral terms of the traditional topics that the traditional language scholar covers under the heading of language, but stated in completely behavioral terms, essentially the terms that he used in his book Behavior of Organisms, which was concerned primarily, the data was all with rats. It was not related to humans in any specific way, but of course from Skinner's perspective, all of the principles were exactly the same principles that affect human behavior. His major conceptual tool would be the three-term relation between stimulus, response, and reinforcement, but also a number of the related concepts: the respondent-operant distinction, unconditioned and conditioned reinforcement, operant conditioning and extinction, the discriminative stimulus, stimulus generalization, the role of motivative and emotional variables, and others.
All of those were what he uses in verbal behavior, but those are the same concepts that were developed in the book Behavior of Organisms, 1938. So, from his behavioral perspective, what is language? What will be his subject matter in the analysis? In terms of stimulus response and reinforcing consequences, how does language behavior differ from non-language? Now, I think what you should do is go to the handout and turn to the first page of the handout so you can follow the handouts as I talk in case you can't see them or in case you want to look back at one that I've already removed. From Skinner's perspective, what is unique about language behavior? What's different about it? Well, is it a different type of response? Is the response itself different from non-language behavior? Is the stimulus different from non-language behavior? Is the reinforcement different? No, none of those are different. You can find non-language behavior that's reinforced in the same way or by the same kind of things that language behavior is reinforced. You can find language behavior with the same topography, the same responses as non-language behavior. The essential difference is how the response achieves its reinforcement. Language behavior achieves its reinforcement indirectly through someone else's behavior. Non-language behavior achieves its reinforcement directly through mechanical contact with the environment. Having decided, then, what his subject matter will be, he needed a special term. He needed a special word to refer to any behavior that is reinforced through the mediation of someone else's behavior. He chose verbal behavior. He considered speech, but speech is no good because it has too much relationship to vocal behavior, to speaking. Language is no good for him because it has too much relation to the practices of verbal communities, like the French language, the German language, a technical language. Here's what he says. The term verbal behavior has much to recommend it. Its etymological sanction is not too powerful, but it emphasizes the individual speaker, and whether recognized by the user or not, specifies behavior shaped and maintained by mediated consequences. It also has the advantage of being relatively unfamiliar in traditional modes of explanation. So what Skinner is saying is this. I'm going to define my subject matter sort of so that it roughly approximates what most people deal with under the heading of language, not everything, but a lot of it. And I'm going to define the special term verbal behavior as any behavior which achieves its reinforcement indirectly through the mediation of some other person's behavior. Whether the behavior is vocal, writing, signing, a gesture, whatever, it will be called verbal behavior if it has its effect on the environment indirectly through someone else's behavior. It will be called nonverbal behavior if its effect is from direct mechanical interaction with the environment. However, there is a source of possible confusion. For Skinner, verbal behavior is any behavior that affects the environment indirectly through someone else's behavior. But the term verbal is used by many people as synonymous with vocal. In other words, many people would say verbal behavior is talking. Writing is not verbal behavior, they would say. Signing is not verbal behavior. Now, there's nothing wrong with that approach, but clearly that's not what Skinner is talking about. So throughout this presentation, don't think vocal when I'm talking about verbal. It's very easy to do. It's very easy to slip back into verbal this, verbal that, and you're thinking, oh, talking. Remember, verbal behavior is vocal behavior. Gesturing, like pointing at something, is verbal because it achieves its reinforcement indirectly through someone else. Signing, sign language of the deaf, is verbal behavior. Writing is verbal behavior. None of those are vocal. Here you can see in this 2x2 table, roughly, verbal vocal behavior, verbal non-vocal. Non-verbal vocal, non-verbal non-verbal, non-verbal non-vocal. You can see that verbal behavior that is non-verbal is a little unusual. We don't have a lot of non-verbal vocal behavior. Most of our vocal sounds have to do with language in one way or another. But coughing, yawning, making meaningless sounds of one way or another, those are non-verbal vocal behavior. In case that type of 2x2 table is a little confusing, here's another way to look at the same things. I won't say anything about that, but there's another source of confusion that I just want to head off of. And remember, by verbal, I don't mean vocal. Another source of confusion is mixing stimulus and response words. It's very easy, even for behavior analysts, to slip into a way of talking about responses with stimulus terms or stimuli with response terms. For example, to talk about a vocal stimulus, that's no good. Vocal is a response word. Vocal is a way of talking about the activity of the vocal musculature. So it should be a vocal response. To talk about a visual stimulus a visual response. A response that produces a visual stimulus, some people will call a visual response. Like writing, they'll say a visual response. Don't do that. Don't refer to auditory responses. Auditory refers to stimuli, visual refers to stimuli, vocal refers to responses. If you mix them in, if stimulus and response are not kept clearly different from each other in your thinking about it, it will make it difficult for you to follow Skinner's analysis or to think clearly about this topic. Remember that these things are in the handout, so if I take it off quickly and you still want to look at it, you can look at it. There are three additional aspects of Skinner's approach that I want to say just almost nothing, very briefly something about, but you can read about it at your leisure. An important aspect of his approach is that he introduces no new principles to deal with verbal behavior. The principles are exactly the same principles that are dealt with in the book Behavior of Organisms. They were sort of finalized by about 1945 and have been the same principles of behavior that are throughout the field of behavior analysis. Principles of reinforcement, extinction, respondent-operant relations, and so on. No new principles are introduced to deal with or help understand language. His general approach is analytical. First, he identifies the elementary operants, and that's what we're going to describe today, and then puts everything together, puts those together to make more complex behavior. He does not introduce more complex behavior defined by itself. One other little point, most of what he talks about in the book Verbal Behavior is the kind of behavior where the response differs from one response to another. In other words, saying cat and saying dog are different vocal responses. Writing cat and writing dog are different responses. The responses, the words or responses differ in the topography of the behavior. In other words, writing and cat and writing dog are different movements. But there's a type of language, and that behavior incidentally is called topography-based. There's a type of language where the topography of the response is irrelevant, and what the response does is point to a stimulus. So, for example, in using a form board or a communication board, a developmentally disabled person or a person with a brain injury might ask for something, not by saying different things or by moving differently, but by simply indicating a stimulus. And the indicating response is almost the same from indicating one stimulus to another. The pointings don't differ much from one another. The difference is the stimulus that they produce. Skinner's analysis works for that type of verbal behavior just as well. He doesn't talk about it very much because there wasn't much of it at that time. A brief criticism. Some people have criticized Skinner's general orientation because he neglects the listener. He doesn't talk much about listeners. He primarily is concerned with the speaker's behavior. And the word speaker refers to the speaker, the signer, the writer, the gesturer. The person who's doing the behaving is what we'll call a speaker. He's mainly interested in the behavior, the variables that control the behavior of the speaker. A speaker, of course, produces stimuli that affect a listener. Listener's behavior is also of interest. But from Skinner's perspective, it doesn't require the special analysis that the behavior of the speaker does. And I give here couple of reasons why. But just keep in mind that some people would say, well, Skinner's analysis is flawed because he doesn't spend a lot of time on the listener, and therefore he doesn't spend a lot of time on receptive language. His main interest is what you could call expressive language. He gets around that difficulty pretty nicely, and he does consider unusual special types of behavior by listeners in the book Verbal Behavior. Now, this skeleton picture of the elementary verbal relations is one that we'll refer back and forth to. Locate it in your handout and fix it so that you can get back to it every once in a while. This is just an overview of the way that verbal operants are laid out. And we'll define these things in detail as we go through this. But I'll just say it for those of you who are somewhat familiar with this stuff as a review, and we'll come back to it from time to time. He describes several different kinds of elementary relations, elementary verbal relations. First of all, we have to decide whether the form of the response, that is, what is said, signed, gestured, what is written, whether the form of the response is controlled by a discriminative stimulus, a stimulus of some sort, or whether it's controlled by an motivated variable or an establishing operation, or what the person wants. If it's controlled by a motivated variable, it's called manned. If it's controlled by a stimulus, then we have to decide, is the stimulus verbal or nonverbal? If it's controlled by a nonverbal stimulus, then it's attacked. If it's controlled by a verbal stimulus, then we have to decide whether there is point-to-point correspondence between stimulus and response, and I'll go into that in great detail, or whether there's not. If there's no point-to-point correspondence, the behavior is called intraverbal. If there is, we have to make a further distinction whether there's formal similarity between stimulus and response product or not. If there's not, it's called textual behavior, or taking dictation. If there is, it's called echoic, copying a text, and mimetic behavior. I'll go over those in some detail, but this is a handy kind of skeleton for you to have in mind as you're thinking about these different verbal operands, and we'll spell it out in detail later. Here's a picture of the elementary verbal relations, the same diagram, but using common sense terms. Here's, if you were explaining to your mother what Skinner's elementary verbal operands consisted of, you could sort of do it this way. The form of the response is it's controlled by what the speaker wants. In other words, if you say water because you want water, then that's a mand. It's called requesting or demanding in common sense terms. If the form of the response, if what it is that is said, written, signed, is determined by what the speaker hears, sees, feels, smells, whatever, then if the stimulus is not a verbal stimulus, if it's not someone else's verbal behavior, the results, if it's an object of some sort, or an action, or an event of some sort, then it's called a tact, and people call that naming or labeling. If it's controlled by a verbal stimulus, a word, a number, a symbol, either spoken or written, and if the response is a different word, in other words, if the stimulus is the word animal, and that makes someone say tiger, the response a different word than the stimulus, then we call it intraverbal behavior. Word sequences, I'll talk about those in detail in a few minutes. If the response is the same word, like for example, if you see the word animal written on the blackboard and you say animal, or if you hear someone say animal and you write animal, or if you hear someone say animal and you say animal, those are all cases where the verbal stimulus is the same word as the response. Now notice it's the same word in one sense. It's not necessarily in the same sense mode. It doesn't have the same necessarily sense qualities, but reading the word dog and saying dog, those are the same words. Reading the word dog and saying cat, on the other hand, you see is a different word, and that's intraverbal behavior. So if it's the same word, then is the response product in the same sense mode or not? The response product is a convenient term Skinner uses, and many people use, to refer to the stimulus that's produced by a response. So the response product of talking is an auditory stimulus. When I talk, how does it affect you? You hear it. So the response product of vocal behavior is an auditory stimulus. The response product of writing is a visual stimulus. How does it affect the viewer? He sees it. If the response product of signing is also a visual stimulus. So if the response product and the stimulus are in the same sense mode and resemble each other, then it's called echoic, copying a text, or mimetic behavior. If the response product is not in the same sense mode as the stimulus, then it's called textual or textual behavior or taking dictation. In other words, let's take reading out loud. You see something on the blackboard and you read it out loud. The stimulus that caused you to read it is visual. You saw it written. The response is vocal, and the response product is auditory. So the stimulus, the visual stimulus, and the response product, the auditory response product, are not in the same sense mode. One's visual, one's auditory. So that qualifies in this category. Response product is not in the same sense mode as the stimulus. So that example I gave was an example of textual behavior. Writing down what you hear somebody say is an example of the same kind, taking dictation. If you copy down what someone says, you hear someone say animal and you write animal. The stimulus that caused it was auditory. You heard them say animal. The response was writing, and the response product is visual. So you have an auditory stimulus, a visual response product, not in the same sense mode, and that's here. If they are in the same sense mode, if you hear someone say dog and you say dog, the stimulus was auditory, the response of saying dog has an auditory response product, they resemble each other, that's echoic behavior. Copying down what you see written and making the same sign that you see someone else make are examples of that type of behavior. Those were common sense terms. Here are technical terms for the same thing. If the form of the response controlled by an establishing operation or a motivated variable, it's a man. By an SD, if it's a nonverbal SD, it's a tact. If it's a verbal SD, and in other words, the response, verbal stimuli is a tricky concept to define in this sense. you could start off by saying, well, a verbal stimulus is a stimulus that results from someone else's verbal behavior. But other people's verbal behavior have more than verbal stimulus characteristics. So, for example, when somebody says cat, the fact that they said cat as a result of seeing a cat or seeing the word cat, that's the verbal aspect of it. But what if they say it loudly or softly? The loudness which they say it is not a verbal stimulus. So a verbal stimulus has loudness as well as its verbal characteristics. But nevertheless, to start with, we're going to call verbal stimuli those that result from someone else's verbal behavior, ignoring the fact that some aspects of verbal stimuli are in fact nonverbal. A sign that says no smoking can be described as a big sign or a small sign, or the sign could be said to be in red letters. Well, those characteristics are not the verbal characteristics. When it says no smoking, that's the verbal part, the part that prevents you from smoking. So, if it's a verbal stimulus, and if there is point-to-point correspondence between stimulus and response, now that concept we'll go into a little more detail in a few minutes, but let me just go over it briefly now. When a stimulus and a response have point-to-point correspondence, that means you can break the response into parts and break the stimulus into parts, and you can show that a part of the stimulus controls a part of the response. So, for example, when a child is being encouraged to say the word alligator, you say to him, say alligator, and he says alligator. The stimulus was an auditory stimulus that began with the sound al, next was the I, next was the ge. So you can see the parts of the stimulus are the auditory stimuli, al, I, ge, so forth. The response that he makes, he then says alligator. Now you can see that the first part of his response, the vocal action that produces the sound al, is closely related to the first part of the stimulus. You don't have any trouble lining up the separate parts, the phonemes or the syllables of the stimulus with the syllables of the response. But notice in the case of when there is no point-to-point correspondence, a tendency to say dog when someone says cat, dog has at least three parts as a stimulus. An auditory stimulus, you have the d sound, the o, and the g sound as three auditory parts. But if someone says cat in response to hearing you say dog, you can break the cat up into parts too. You have the k sound, a, and the t. But you can see the k sound of the cat has no more to do with the d sound of dog than with the o sound of dog or with the g sound of dog. In other words, although both have parts, the parts are unrelated to each other. To say cat as a result of hearing someone say dog, you're responding to the total word, not to the parts of the word, not to the phonemes, not to the letters. So when there is no point-to-point correspondence, then it's called interverbal behavior. When there is point-to-point correspondence, if there is formal similarity, then it's echoic, copic, text, mimetic. If there's no formal similarity, textual, taking dictation. We'll go over each of those now in some detail. Let me go back to these just to show you this skeleton again. Man, tact, intraverbal. Those three are, in one sense, simpler to talk about. These require the more complex definition involving formal similarity. Remember now, when I say verbal, I don't mean vocal. I don't mean to exclude vocal. Verbal behavior can be vocal, but it can also be written, it can be signed, it can be a simple gesture, and so forth. So verbal doesn't mean vocal exclusively. Now, let's look at the man to start with. Just in case, probably everybody here is familiar with the sign language of the deaf. You see the translator or the interpreter providing sign language responses. Sign language of the deaf, if you're not familiar with it, it is a very sophisticated, highly effective form of language. It is not to be interpreted as simply translation of English words into gestures. It is another language in the same sense that Russian should not be interpreted as the translation of English words into Russian. It's not equivalent to fingerspelling. Fingerspelling is to make make hand movements for each letter. This is A, B, C. That's fingerspelling. Sign language consists in making arm, hand, facial expression, body movements that are related more to words or sentences than they are to particular sounds. So, for example, the sign for cat is to go like so, stroking imaginary vibrissa, for example. The sign for dog is sort of like slapping the thigh, and I'm not a fluent signer by any means, so some of mine may be incorrect, for which the interpreter may correct me. Demand is the type of verbal behavior where the response is controlled by an establishing operation, a motivated variable, by what the organism wants. If you say water because you're thirsty and would like to get some, that's a mand. If you say water because you see some and somebody asks what's that, that's not a mand. In everyday terms, a mand is a verbal response where the form of the response, what is said, is determined by an establishing operation, by what the speaker wants, or in terms of a unique reinforcement history in which the response has been reinforced by a characteristic or specific reinforcer. The response forms can be anything. The things manded can be anything. The reinforcement, it's a very important feature that the reinforcement is specific to each mand. In other words, the reinforcement for requesting something is getting what you request. The reinforcement for saying water as a mand is to get the water. The reinforcement for saying stand up is the person you say it to stands up. The reinforcement you can see is specific to each type of verbal operant or each mand response. Whether the response occurs or not may be dependent upon stimuli, but what it is that is said or signed or gestured or written, what it is that is said, signed, or written depends upon the establishing operation. Whether you do it or not depends upon other things. For example, we typically do not request unless there's somebody around that can answer the request. So we might want water, but we don't say water when there's no one around. But someone now comes into the room, and under those circumstances, we might say water. The person coming in the room is a stimulus. You might say, well, didn't you say that the mands are not controlled by a stimulus? Well, the form of the mand is not controlled by a stimulus. In other words, somebody comes in the room and the guy says water. The fact that he says water rather than food, rather than out, rather than stand up, is controlled by an establishing operation, by a motivating variable. The fact that he says anything at all and doesn't say it until someone comes in, that's another issue. All of the other verbal relations, tact, interverbal, the ones controlled by other verbal stimuli, all of those are reinforced by general reinforcement of some sort. In other words, when somebody asks you what's that, and you name it for them for one purpose or as a part of an educational process, the reinforcement you get for correct naming is not related to what you named. When you mand something, the reinforcement is related to what you manded. But when you name an object correctly, or when a child, for example, is learning language, and you ask him, you're trying to get him to learn the names of different things, you say, what's that, what's this, and so forth. When he gives the correct answer, the reinforcement he gets will be you're saying good naming behavior, good tacting behavior, good job or something. But you can see what you say doesn't relate to what his response was. When he tacts, or when he says correctly, you point at a cup and say, what's that? And he says cup. You say good. You point at a comb and you say, what's that? He says comb. You say good. The same good. In other words, the reinforcement is general reinforcement, not specific to this type of behavior, for all of them except the man. With the man, the reinforcement is specific to the type of behavior that's occurring. Now, here's manned examples, and I've got these down as sort of like, if we had more time, I would do this as a workshop. I'd give you all little sheets of paper, little cards, red, green, and yellow, and then I'd ask you, how many of you think that this is something, and you'd hold up your card and we could see and so forth. That would take far too long. The answers to all of these are at the back of the handout. So if you want to peek ahead, you can do that, or you can just look at them as I talk them through. So rather than, and this of course is probably the story of my life, rather than trying to obtain verbal behavior from you, I'm going to emit it myself. I'm not a good listener. So let's look at the first one. The person says out in order to get LRV, the listener, the reader, the viewer of signs. The person says out in order to get the person to open a door. Now you have to classify this as a man, other verbal behavior, or nonverbal behavior. It's quite clear that the language to get somebody to do something, that implies what somebody wants. So that's clearly a man. You say out to get someone to open a door, that's a man. You open a window because you want to cool the room. Now, the opening of the window is related to a motivated variable, all right, to an establishing operation, you're too warm. But that's not verbal behavior. Opening a window, in other words, manding is verbal behavior controlled by an EO, but EOs control a lot of nonverbal behavior as well. So that's an example of nonverbal behavior. To write stop as a result of hearing someone say stop. You're not asking for anything. You heard somebody say it and you wrote it down. Now, the reasons why one writes down what people say, these examples may seem a little bit unrealistic, but remember, we're dealing with the elements of the verbal relationships, and these are parts of larger things that might be more reasonable. You might write something down for good reasons, because you wanted a note, and you wanted to copy what the person said, or you wanted to have it available. But so, to write stop as a result of hearing someone say stop is clearly not a man. It's another type of verbal behavior. To sign hello in order to get the listener, the viewer, to look at you. That's very much like a speaker who says, to attract someone's attention, hello, and then the person looks, you say, can you tell me what time it is? Or another way to, another kind of, similar kind of demand for attention is to say, pardon me. So signing hello in order to get the viewer to look at you is an example of a man. To say coffee as a result of smelling the odor of coffee. Well, one, you're not asking for anything, are you? So it's clearly not a man. Is it verbal behavior? Sure. The fact that the stimulus is not a verbal stimulus doesn't make it nonverbal behavior. It's a tact. To say coffee as a result of smelling the odor of coffee illustrates the fact that verbal responses that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, tacts, are controlled by all kinds of stimuli, not just auditory or visual stimuli. You smell coffee and you say coffee, that's a tact. And that's other verbal behavior. You point to your wrist so that the viewer will tell you the time. You go like this. That's a man. You're asking for something. It's a form of man. It's not different in principle than saying, can you tell me what time it is? To say Jones in response to someone asking you for Mary's last name. What's Mary's last name? And you say Jones. Are you asking for anything? No. You're not demanding anything, so it's not a man. Is it verbal behavior? Well, saying Joan in response to the verbal stimuli of somebody else's question looks like it would qualify as verbal behavior. It could function as intraverbal behavior, we'll talk about later. It has a somewhat peculiar status, and some people might want to give it some special category. To say taxi as a result of seeing one, that's clearly not a man. You're not asking for a taxi. So that's other verbal behavior. To run as a result of being in a hurry, that's controlled by an establishing operation, all right, but of course it's not verbal behavior. It's not behavior. In these cases, opening a window to get cooler, running in order to get someplace in a hurry, you can see are not reinforced through someone else's behavior. They're reinforced directly. You run, you get there quicker. You open the window and you get cooler, not through someone else. Now let's look at the main features of the tact relation. Let me put this back. See, we just finished the man, forms controlled by an EO. Now we're on form controlled by a stimulus, and in this case a nonverbal stimulus, the tact. I talk fast, but fortunately you have the handout. A tact is a type of verbal behavior where the response form, what it is that is said, written, signed, is controlled by an immediately prior nonverbal stimulus. It's a nonverbal stimulus, an object, an action, a relation, a property of an object, and so forth. Many people refer to those as naming and labeling. The kind of response forms can be anything: speaking, writing, signing, whatever. The sense mode of the stimulus can be anything: smelling coffee and having a tendency to say coffee is an example of a tact controlled by an olfactory stimulus. Tasting something and saying sweet or sour is an example of a tact controlled by a gustatory stimulus. Touching something and saying warm, controlled by a tactile stimulus. The things tacted, what kind of things do we name or describe or label? Everything in the world. Reinforcement is generalized reinforcement. In other words, when we name things, what do we get out of naming something accurately? Well, it's behavior that we're doing it for someone else. What do they give us for it? Or what do we get out of it in the sense of naming something? Well, what we get, it may be in an educational setting that we get social approval for learning the new name of something, as in a child's training situation. As an adult, we get, when we provide information to someone, we provide the name of an object for someone, they don't know what it is, what's this? We say it's a screwdriver, then they either directly reinforce us by praising us, thank you very much, or even without that, we may be reinforced by the knowledge that it helped them in some way. When we're interacting socially, you don't have to get praise for everything. Somebody asks you for something, a friend asks you for something, you provide the information. Even if the person does not say thank you, you're reinforced by the fact that the person is then able to do something else. The reinforcement is not specific to the particular tact. When you tact water, or you tact cup, or you tact comb, you could never tell by seeing what a person got as reinforcement what the tact was. With a mand, notice that if you had to guess what the mand consisted of and you were told what the reinforcement was, you could pretty much guess the mand. What the guy got, a person manded. Somebody gives you kind of a puzzle. Person manded, and I'll tell you it was a mand, all right. And what happened is the person watching him took out this little white cylindrical thing and took out a source of flame and handed it to the person and then lit it for him. What do you suppose the mand was? It's obvious. The mand was cigarette, or may I have a cigarette or something like that. But suppose suppose I tell you, now here's what happened. A person asked our speaker what something was, and he tacted it. He made a tact. Now I'll tell you, the reinforcement he got for the tact was that the person nodded and smiled. What was he tacting? What was the tact? You can see you can't tell what the tact was. Not from the reinforcement, but from the mand, the reinforcement tells you. Here's some tact and mand examples. Here we are, tact, mand, other verbal behavior, or nonverbal behavior. We'll run through these. I'm through, I can go home. Okay, a tendency to say out as a result of hearing someone else say out. Well, that's clearly not a tact because this is a verbal stimulus. Hearing somebody say something is a verbal stimulus. Remember, tacts are controlled by nonverbal stimuli. So that's other verbal behavior. A say window as a result of seeing a window. That's a tact. A window is a nonverbal stimulus. Say to sign cat as a result of seeing that. Now that's a written word, cat. To sign cat as a result of seeing the word cat, well, the word cat's not a nonverbal stimulus, so it's clearly not a tact. It's clearly not a mand, you're not asking for anything. And it's a type of behavior later we'll refer to as intraverbal behavior because of the peculiar fact that there is no point-to-point relationship between any signs and any spoken or written words. So it would be called intraverbal behavior. To say coffee is a result of smelling the odor of coffee, clearly a tact. To write coffee is a result of hearing tea. Well, hearing tea is not a nonverbal stimulus. Tea, of course, is a nonverbal stimulus, but not when I have a quotation around it. The quotation indicates that it's a verbal stimulus. So our speaker heard someone say tea and wrote coffee. A good example of verbal behavior, but not a tact and not a mand. Say, to open a door in response to a listener saying open. Now that's a very tricky and common one. The listener is manding. No question. The listener says open. And his behavior or her behavior is a mand to the speaker. The speaker then opens the door. Well, that's not verbal behavior. It's a response to a verbal stimulus, but it's not verbal behavior, even though it may be reinforced by another person. That's a complicated example, reacting to other people's mands, and that we'll cover that in the advanced version of the course. A tendency to say taxi as a result of wanting one, clearly a mand. So say taxi as a result of seeing the word taxi, not a mand. Remember, if the word, to say taxi as a result of seeing a taxi, that would be a tact. To say taxi as a result of seeing the word taxi is not a tact, and it's not a mand, it's other verbal behavior. An adult points at an object and says, what's that? The child looks and says, cup. Now notice, you might think, well, the kid saying cup was controlled by a verbal stimulus. The adult said, what's that? But notice, the adult said, what's that, to get him to tact, but what he said was not controlled by a verbal stimulus. In other words, if the adult had been pointing at something else, he wouldn't have said cup. So saying cup, the form of the response, is not controlled by the stimulus, what's that? You could never tell what a person was going to tact by just knowing that the person that was speaking to him said, what's that? You'd have to know what he was pointing at. I won't spend much time on this. There's useful, interesting contrasts between the man and tact relationships. There's useful ways of thinking about and contrasting them. And there's also something you should know about the audience relation. Skinner introduces the audience as simply another form of behavior controlled by a nonverbal stimulus. So the audience relation, the audience is the person that you're talking to. And audience doesn't mean an audience like this. It means simply the listener. The audience variable differs from the tact. The audience is typically a nonverbal stimulus. A person's appearance, a person's facial characteristics, a person's clothing. Those are nonverbal stimuli that characterize the audience. But so therefore, the audience relation is like a tact. But it differs in several ways, and those are laid out here. Read them at your leisure. Now we're going to consider the main features of the interverbal relation. Type of verbal behavior with a response form controlled by a verbal stimulus, product of someone else's verbal behavior, with which it does not have point-to-point correspondence. Point-to-point correspondence, the parts of the stimulus are closely linked or can be related to the parts of the response. Notice that that's the case with words like you see the written word animal and you say animal. The parts of the stimulus and the parts of the response can be related to one another. But if you see the written word animal and you say tiger or zoo or canine, the parts of the stimulus of animal are not related to any of the parts of the word canine, for example. They're related to it as a whole. Now notice that in signing, I'll just use the example of the sign for cat. The sign for cat consists in raising the face. I'll bring it down in parts. Typically it's done so rapidly that you hardly even notice what the parts are. Well, consider it. Let's break it into three parts. First part is to raise the hand toward the face, to put the fingers together and to move the hand away from the face, like stroking vibrissa. It's typically done rapidly like that. Now you can see you can break that into parts. Suppose a person who's teaching sign has a tendency, or a student who's learning sign is learning to name, to give the English word for those signs. So the student sees the person go like this. The teacher says, "Okay, okay, class, tell me what the sign is." The teacher goes like so, and the student says cat. Now notice that the sign can be broken into three parts. 1, 2, 3. Saying cat can be broken into three parts. K, a, t. But notice that they don't go together in any way. Even though you might say, yeah, but they mean the same thing. Meaning has nothing to do with anything in Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. That will throw you off if you try to do it that way. It's true that to sign cat is a sign, a verbal response that's controlled very much by the same nonverbal circumstances as a tact, that the word cat, said or written by a vocal person, also controlled the same way. But as far as point-to-point correspondence goes, there is none. No parts of this are related to the C any more than they are to the A or to the T. So all words, relationships to signs, or vice versa, signs producing words, are interverbal responses, not any of the ones that involve point-to-point correspondence. The response forms in the controlling stimuli, are, they can be almost anything, except they do have to be verbal stimuli. Notice the example here also shows how the parts of the stimulus and the parts of the response are not systematically related. Here are some examples. Interverbal examples. You have to decide whether it's an interverbal response, a tact, or some other kind. A tendency to say over as a result of hearing under. Good example of interverbal behavior. Words tend to control on normal speakers' parts the opposite words to some extent. If I said to you, write down all the things that you're reminded of when I say over, well, many people would write under as one of them. Over has some controlling relationship to responses like space, location, under, etc. So that's a good interverbal response. Say window as a result of seeing the written word window. No good. Point-to-point correspondence. Say cat as a result of seeing someone sign cat. Certainly no good. A right cat, I mean. Certainly no good because there's no point-to-point relation between any signs and any words. That's not a defect in either the words or the signs, you understand. It's simply a different kind of language relation. To say cup as a result of seeing a cup of coffee. Clearly a tact. Sign cat as a result of seeing someone sign dog. That's interverbal behavior within sign language. That's like you're saying cat as a result of hearing someone say dog. To say cat as a result of seeing a dog. Now that one throws people off sometimes. Notice what you have to ask is this. Is the controlling stimulus a verbal or nonverbal stimulus? To say cat as a result of seeing a dog is a nonverbal stimulus, isn't it? So that's clearly not intraverbal behavior, although if you said cat as a result of hearing someone say dog, it would be intraverbal. But if you say cat as a result of seeing a dog, that's a tact. It's not a very accurate tact. It's a case where a nonverbal stimulus reminds you of something, but nevertheless, it's a tact. To write cat as a result of seeing the word cat, clearly not a tact, clearly not intraverbal behavior. Say taxi as a result of hearing taxi, also not an intraverbal, not a tact, but it is verbal behavior. Hungry child enters the kitchen, would really like a cookie, but there's no one there, no appropriate audience. So no verbal behavior occurs. Then the parent comes into the kitchen and the child says cookie. Is it the case that the parent's arrival controls the form of the response? Could it then be called, for example, a tact? No, because it's true that the parent, he didn't say anything until the parent came in. The parent's arrival makes him say, but it doesn't make him say cookie. It's the establishing operation, the fact that he wants a cookie, that makes him say cookie. Had he wanted out, when the parent came in, he would have said out. He doesn't say anything until the appropriate SD is there, but what he says is controlled by the motivated variable in the case of the man. Now we're getting close to the next session. The point-to-point correspondence and no formal similarity, textual behavior, and point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity, copying a text, mimetic behavior, echoic behavior, are best thought of in contrast with each other. I think you can read these carefully when you get ready to. Let us run through some examples to illustrate them. A tendency to say over. Now we're going to classify it as intraverbal, echoic. Echoic is saying the same thing you hear, echoing what somebody says. CT is for copying a text. That's writing down what you see written, writing it down as accurately as you can. Textual behavior is saying what you see written, in other words, reading out loud, without necessarily understanding what you're reading. TD is for taking dictation, writing down what you hear someone say, and mimetic behavior is signing what you see someone sign, essentially accurately. A tendency to say over is a result of seeing the word over. Well, the stimulus is visual, the response is vocal. They are not in the same sense mode. The stimulus and the response product are not in the same sense mode, so that constitutes textual behavior. Say over is a result of seeing. You see the written word over, and you say over. That's reading out loud. To say window is a result of hearing window. Now, someone said window, and you heard it, and now you say the same thing. That's echoic behavior. The stimulus is visual, the response product is visual, and they resemble each other. So that's echoic behavior, saying what you hear said. Say cat as a result of seeing someone sign cat. Once again, that's intraverbal behavior. The parts of the sign for cat have no relationship to the separate parts of the word cat, either written or spoken. To write cup as a result of seeing coffee. Now that's an example of an intraverbal response. You see the word coffee, and you write cup. Notice that many of Skinner's examples are given in vocal behavior, simply to make it simply talks almost exclusively about vocal behavior, but everything he says also applies equally well to writing, to signing, and whatever. So you write cup as a result of seeing the word coffee. That's an intraverbal response. This is a different word in the common sense terms, or coffee as a visual stimulus, as a verbal stimulus, has no point-to-point relationship with the parts of cup. Sign cat as a result of seeing someone sign cat. Now that's mimetic behavior. You sign what you see someone sign. Mimetic behavior. Say cat as a result of seeing dog, seeing the word dog. Clearly intraverbal behavior. It's a verbal stimulus. You say cat. Write cat as a result of seeing the verbal stimulus, cat, written. Now there, the stimulus is visual, consisting of the letters C-A-T. The response is writing, and the response product is also visual. So they resemble each other. So that's a case of copying a text. That's where the stimulus and response product are in the same sense mode, and they resemble each other. Now I realize this goes very fast. What you really need to do is take the handout home and go through it at a leisure, instead of going to the French Quarter this afternoon or this evening. To say taxi is a result of hearing the word taxi. Well, that's clearly echoic behavior. You're saying what you heard someone else say. To say, to write running as a result of hearing running. Now, someone said it, you wrote it down. That's taking dictation. No point-to-point, I mean, there's point-to-point correspondence, but there's no formal similarity. You heard someone say running, that's an auditory stimulus. You then wrote running. The response product is visual, so they're not in the same sense mode, so it is an example of taking dictation. Textual and taking dictation, they're not in the same sense mode, echoic, copying a text, and mimetic they are. To sign stand-up, seeing someone else sign stand-up. That's mimetic behavior, making the same sign someone else makes. To say happy is a result of seeing the word happy. That's textual behavior. You're reading out loud. To write running is a result of seeing the word running. That's copying a text. At this point, thank you for attending and putting up with this rapid-fire treatment of a topic. I teach this class at Western and have taught it for many years, and we spend about the first 3 weeks going through the elementary verbal relations, but in much more detail, of course, and it's much more leisurely. The student has a chance to try something, make a few mistakes, get it corrected, try some more things. This is not an easy way to learn this stuff by itself, but perhaps it'll be a useful introduction. I'd suggest restudying the handouts. I'd suggest also that any of you want to give a workshop yourself or give a tutorial yourself using these things, feel free to duplicate my handouts and use them any way you want. There's no copywriting involved here. You can copy the handouts. You can modify them in any way you want, use them in your own presentation. You can even take credit for it if you want. If you would like to have a set of full-sized overheads, let's see, where is my... Here we are. If you'd like to have a set of full-sized overheads, not in transparency paper, but in plain ordinary paper, write me or I almost said sign. Write me or email me, and I will send them to you. I'm sorry, what? Oh, you post the email, you mean, or you... Oh, all of this stuff will be on the web page. Yes, you'll put my overheads on the Verbal Behavior Special Interest Group web page. That'll also be useful. I guess the only thing I wouldn't like you to do, feel free to copy the material, use it any you want. The only thing I would not like you to do is to copy the material and then have it copyrighted and then sue me for giving it today. Thank you. Thank you, Clark, for having me for this. Thank you.